I'm happy to start, David, whenever you think, whenever you want.
Yeah, no, go for it.
Go for it, all right. Can we commence, please, everybody, with a welcome to all our members, visitors, and I understand we're going to have quite a number of visitors during the course of the evening. I was going to welcome Lady Cowan, but I'm told she's not with us, and to get up the first AFL match of the 2021 season to join with us. If we could, this is our annual general meeting, and I think the minutes of the annual general meeting of the 12th of March 2020 have been circulated, and I would invite anyone with any comments on those to please say something, or else if someone can move and second that they be accepted.
I move they be accepted.
Oh, second.
I think Liz has seconded that. We'll take it that they've been passed, David. We go from there to the President's report. It won't be very long. I know we're waiting to hear Professor Rutland, but I have a brief President's report that I should now deliver. The last annual general meeting of the Society was held on the 12th of March 2020. That saw the election of 11 members of the committee. It was chaired by the outgoing President Howard Freeman as to the first half, and by myself as to the second half. At a committee meeting in July last year, Professor Andrew Marcus and Joel Silver joined the committee.
Ada, are you okay up there?
From March last year, we've managed to carry on activities whilst coping with the pandemic. All our functions have been conducted online. Hopefully, we'll now be able to return to our normal mode of meeting in the near future. Our last in-person meeting, we heard from Anna Epstein, who addressed us on her book, Melek Ravitch, the urbane Yiddish poet. And in August, we convened again, virtually, how I hate that word, to hear Dr. Sue Silverberg speak on her book, A Networked Community. In October, we heard from Dr. Avril Alba on a review of the Demidenko-Darvel controversy. And in November, from Dr. Harry Liu on his book, Patterson of Israel. All these events could only have been held with the huge amount of work done by our Secretary, David Marlowe, and I paid tribute to David's work and outstanding technical skills, without which none of this could have happened. Our journal was published and distributed late last year and retains its very high quality. I thank Hilary Rubenstein in particular for the enormous amount of work involved, and believe that there are contributors lined up waiting to have articles published. And Liz James has assumed responsibility for the distribution of future journals, and I thank Liz and Ron for undertaking this very onerous task. Tonight we are privileged to hear from Emerita Professor Suzanne Rutland, who comes to us from Israel, and in a moment I shall ask Bill Rubenstein to introduce her. As probably the only member of the committee with a degree in Latin, I must confess my embarrassment in not being the one to pick up the solecism in the advertising of her as emeritus. There are just two further matters that I should mention in this AGM President's report. One involves the publication of a book called Traitors and Spies, published by Allen and Unwin. In that book, the author John Fahey claims that Hirsch Munz, a founding member of our society, was part of a cabal of Jewish businessmen based in Melbourne who spied for the Soviet Union. I have had some communication with his son Martin Munz and understand that a response to what appears to be a monstrous calumny is likely to appear in the next journal out of Sydney. The other matter involves the archives of the Melbourne Hebrew Congregation. Howard Freeman has been endeavouring to reach some accord with the Melbourne Hebrew Congregation for over 20 years to safeguard its deteriorating historical records. I've spent much time in conversation with a subcommittee that they've finally established to tackle the problem. The discussions are progressing with the Melbourne Hebrew Congregation and the State Library of Victoria, and I thank Sue Silverberg, one of our members, for playing a leading role in these negotiations. I'm optimistic that we will reach some sort of resolution in the near future. I think we go from here to the Treasurer's report, to the election of the committee, and then Professor Rubinstein will introduce Suzanne Rutland. So if we can go from there to the Treasurer's Report 2, please.
Sure. Good evening, everybody. Treasury report this year is pretty brief because as far as activities of the Society is concerned, the year was pretty brief. I must tell you that if you would like a copy of the accounts, all you need to do is email me at optimise@optusnet.com.au and I'll be pleased to send you a copy of the accounts. Now, the accounts show that subscriptions in the 2020 year were down by 30% from the year before. The result for the year was a small loss of $302, which, having regard to the year that it was, is a pretty remarkable result, I think. But it's in no measure due to anything that I did or anybody else did. It was just the way the numbers fell out. We did pay for one set of the journal, and the other costs, which were just printing and incidentals, were rather small. So loss for the year, $302. The previous year saw a surplus of $8,158, but that was mostly because the last of the Pratt Foundation's donations to us came in the 2019 year. Members' funds at the end of December this year, $26,386. Most of that was cash at the Commonwealth Bank, $24,000, and the rest were just incidentals. So I'm happy to take any questions you've got and happy to send you a copy of the accounts if you email me that you would like a set. That's it, Gavin.
Thank you very much, Alan, much appreciated. David, I think the election of the committee for the forthcoming year is the next item on the agenda, and I trust you have that in hand.
Yeah, well, basically, we had everybody on the existing committee nominated, nobody else nominated. So I think we automatically, everybody is re-elected or reaffirmed on the committee unless anyone's got any objections. And Alan, no, you can't object to me anymore. All silent, all done, thank you.
Well, let's take it that the existing committee.
It took longer than the West
Thank you very much.
election.
Can I ask, please, Professor Bill Rubinstein, can I ask Professor Bill Rubinstein, please, to introduce Emerita.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Professor Suzanne.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
What are we doing here? Sorry. Am I on? Sorry.
Yes, you're on.
Okay.
Keep
I
going.
worked closely with Isi Leibler for nearly 15 years, from the early 1980s until the mid-1990s. I don't want to seem any more provocative than I have to be, but in my opinion, Isi Leibler was the greatest man I ever met, including everyone I've ever met. He was the only charismatic man I ever met. The term charismatic is widely misunderstood. It does not mean a popular person with many friends at all. The term was coined by the great German sociologist Max Weber, who was examining types of political leaders and their authority. Some are elected, some inherit their positions, and some become leaders by charisma, which he defined as rule by force of personality. Weber died in 1920 during the Spanish flu epidemic, before the time of the dictators like Hitler and Mussolini, and he apparently had in mind religious leaders like Joan of Arc. Now, Isi Leibler is the only leader I have ever met who ruled by force of personality. I vividly recall the meetings of the ECAJ, the Executive Council of Australian Jewry's executive at the old Beth Weitzman. These were attended by 15 or 20 of the most senior leaders of Jewish bodies in Australia, many with hundreds of members. Isi Leibler presided over these meetings as president of the ECAJ. They reacted to him as kindergarten children reacted to their teacher. In all seriousness, if Isi had told the people that had climbed to the roof of Beth Weitzman and jump off, I'm being serious when I say that half of them would have done just that. I was often told by people who knew about his remarkable powers that they were grateful he used them to benefit the Jewish people as he did, rather than to do harm to the Jewish people. Isi Leibler certainly deserves a full biography by a well-qualified historian and writer, and in Suzanne Rutland, he has found just that. She is, as far as I know, the only person to become a professor at the university here based on her research and writing about Australian Jewish history. She is the author of Edge of the Diaspora, an important full-scale general history of the Australian Jewish community from 1788 to the recent times. And she will be known to all members of our society as the editor of the issues of our journal published in Sydney. She now lives in Israel, where she has had complete access to all of Isi's files and papers and has produced an outstanding work. With no more ado, I will turn the proceedings over to Professor Rutland. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill, and for your kind words. Can everyone hear me and see the screen okay?
I can see the screen, but I can't see you. Is that?
As long as you can see the screen. That's important.
Now I can see you, yes.
If you put on speaker view, you should be able to see me.
Yes.
Dear fellow Historical Society members and visitors, firstly, thank you, Bill, for your warm words. I'm not living full-time in Israel. Since retirement, I've lived about half the year here and half the year in Sydney. I'm back and forth normally as a member of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. So when I come to Europe for a meeting, normally, I come on here. I was away from Israel for 11 months in Sydney, thanks to Corona. But luckily, I was able to get permission to come here for an extended research period from the government at the end of last year. And of course, one of the reasons why I really wanted to be here was that I knew the book would come out. I knew that Isi's health was bad and that it would really mean a lot, both to me and to him, for me to be in Israel physically when the book came off the press hot in Israel. It's still awaiting in Australia. And I'd also really appreciate this invitation to address you all for the Victorian AGM. You may wonder how I came to write this biography. Well, over the last 20 years, I've had the honor and privilege of researching in Isi Leibler's extensive library and archive. Sorry, just one sec. There we go. What I call a treasure trove for an historian. And by the way, a treasure trove to which I owe a lot to Hilary as Isi's archivist over a number of years. As she wrote to me and is quoted in the book, her beloved document. I may ask, I wonder if people can mute themselves if they're not muted, please. You might ask how I came to get the key to this treasure trove. At the end of last century, I was invited to write a history of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, a job I still have to finish. However, I became so engrossed in the history of the struggle of Soviet Jews that became a major focus. I was aware of Isi's landmark 1965 publication on Soviet Jews and human rights, and the letter which Rex Mortimer wrote at the beginning of the publication, acknowledging that there was anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. I managed to get access to Mortimer's secret security file from the National Archives of Australia and found that each time Isi's name was mentioned, I could see a reference to him with a number after it, so that I knew that he had his own security file. However, to get access, and this is just an image from Anti-Semitism of the book. However, to get access, when I applied for access to the file, I was told they could not locate it. After 9 months back and forth with their stating they could not find the file, and my insisting that it had to be there, they finally located it. It was unbelievable. As part of his efforts, Isi was constantly chasing the Australian communist leaders because he had been urged by the legendary Shaul Avigor, who had recruited him to see if he could get a communist leader to admit to Soviet anti-Semitism. Avigor stressed that there was no point for others to make that claim because the Soviet response would just be that they were anti-communist. A communist leader who had spent time in Moscow and was deeply embedded in the party structure was another story. During a visit to Jerusalem at the end of 1999, my son at the time was president of the World Union of Jewish Students, I came armed with a copy of telephone conversations between Isi and various communist leaders, as well as conversations they had behind his back. While the ASIO, the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, was not tapping Isi's phone, they were tapping the phones of various communist leaders. Some of these copies included conversations between two Melbourne Jewish communists, Bernie Taft, a party hack, and Judah Watton, an Australian writer and novelist who hated Isi with a passion. Isi always suspected he had a security file, but now he knew his suspicions were correct. I had found the key that opened the treasure trove. And here we are today talking about the publication of his biography. One of the challenges facing a biographer is how to structure the story. Should it be purely chronological or should it be thematic? I looked at Jill Margot's award-winning biography of Frank Lowy and saw that she took a purely chronological approach, but I felt that that was not appropriate for Isi's story. Some facets, such as his business story, would only be of interest to one group of readers. Others, the international story, the World Jewish Congress, might also only be of interest to certain groups of readers. So I decided to structure the book as a mixture, allowing the chronology to determine the order of the thematic chapters. There are so many facets in Isi's life that in a short talk like this, I can only touch on a few aspects, and indeed only a couple of the elements relating to these aspects, including his campaigns for Soviet Jewry, his opposition to anti-Semitism, his building a travel agent empire, his relationship with Australian politicians, his connections with Asia, his intellectualism, and his love of family. So just looking briefly, and I don't know if this is in people's way, let me move it down a bit. Just looking briefly, obviously a key element of his life was his involvement with the campaign for Soviet Jewry. This was an involvement that took place over more than 3 decades. As I've already mentioned, Isi was recruited by Shaul Avigor in 1959 to be the liaison person for the Israeli Soviet Jewry movement in the Asia-Pacific region, working with Emmanuel Litvinov in London, well-known intellectual and novelist, and Moshe Dekter in the United States. They were constantly in touch throughout the 1960s, and I have read so much correspondence from them. Isi also wrote articles for the general press to increase awareness and was consistent in his campaign with politicians. There were 3 major developments in the 1960s. Firstly, Australia was the first country in the world before the United States, well before, to raise the issue at the United Nations in 1962. Secondly, as I've already mentioned, his 1965 book on Soviet Jews and human rights, with the introductory letter from Mortimer, was of groundbreaking significance. And thirdly, his campaign against Goldman in terms of the suitable tactics that were needed for the campaign for Soviet Jewry, public demonstrations, as Isi was advocating, or quiet diplomacy, as Goldman advocated. In the late 1970s, Isi again became directly involved, having been selected by the Australian Olympic Federation to be Australia's official travel agent after Jet Set's success in filling this role in Montreal. Encouraged by the Israelis, he accepted this challenge. He faced severe criticisms and really terribly tough in Melbourne, but he argued that he would be able to have direct access as a communal leader within the USSR. He was urged by the Lishka, the Soviet liaison officer office for Soviet Jewry in Israel, to proceed, and given contacts with Fuzniks and instructions on how to meet them. At the urging of both the Israelis and the refuseniks, he decided not to campaign for a boycott, but to run on the slogan, "No games without human rights." Isi undertook 3 trips to Moscow. The first tour in 1978, after which the Soviets did their best to try to persuade the Australian Olympic Federation to drop Isi, whom they described as a criminal. But we've just heard from Bill, Isi was not going to hear no, and threatened legal action against the AFO if they dared to drop him. They didn't. And on his 3rd trip in 1980, he was arrested on his departure, and when he was finally permitted to leave, he was told that never again would he enter the Soviet Union. Yet, 7 years later, he was to return with Perestroika and Gorbachev. He was invited, and he met up again with many of the refuseniks in 1987. And again, just 1 year later, these refuseniks were freed, and 15 of them, amazingly, came to Melbourne to be welcomed by Isi and to celebrate their freedom. And just 1 year later, less than a year actually, in February 1989, Isi established the first cultural center, Jewish cultural center in Moscow, which opened with huge fanfare, including an amazing very first Jewish concert to be held in Moscow, with Hebrew songs being sung openly by the legendary Yaffa Yokoni and Dudu Fisher. It marked the full opening of gates for Soviet Jews, with 1 million migrating to Israel between 1988 and 1997. However, Isi did not just focus on fighting anti-Semitism abroad. From the 1960s onwards, he also fought all manifestations of anti-Semitism at home. In 1965, there was a new phase of anti-Semitism which began in Australia, with 2 key groups joining forces: the Australian League of Rights, led by Eric Butler, and the anti-Bolshevik Bloc of Nations. These 2 groups were joined by an obsessional fear of communism, which they blamed on the Jews. They supported the distribution of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, fostering the various conspiracy theories against Jews. The views of Butler were intensified by the East European emigre groups, which had dubious connections with fascist and neo-Nazi activities, including the Ustaše and their support for Ante Pavlik. Isi responded to these challenges with a new, young, aggressive leadership. He stressed no one should keep one's head down, an approach he developed in response to playground anti-Semitism he had heard about at Melbourne High from his Jewish friends. At the same time, you have to read more in the book, at the same time, he supported an intellectual response, working with academics such as John Playford in Adelaide in terms of the East Europeans, and Ken Gott of Melbourne with the publication of Voices of Hate, which we can see the cover of here. In this way, he brought the issues into the public arena through academic scholarship. He continued to advocate for these policies as president, first of the Victorian Jewish Board of Deputies, and later, of course, today, the JCCV, and later during his 4 terms as president of the ECAJ. By the way, an honor he only shared with Sid Einfeld and Morris Ashkenazi, as well as through his leadership of the Australian Institute of Jewish Affairs, which he was seminal in establishing. Another obvious theme running through the book is his business activities, and most importantly, his building up of Jet Set. This is an amazing story of how he became involved in a tiny one-man suburban travel agency run by his friend, Holocaust survivor, Bonner Wiener, and how within a couple of years, he had moved the agency to the city and laid the basis for building a major travel company. He did this through his early recognition of the importance of group travel that he learned through taking on the job of being the travel agent for Academy, the AJHS, the first time a group of young people went through AJHS to Israel. That first group went in 1965. Isi organized it, and from that he expanded to the British, the Greek, the Italians, the post-war migrants who were, by the late 1960s, in the position of wanting to go home to Europe to visit family. However, in doing so, this young, aggressive entrepreneur trod on the toes of some of the key Qantas management. We see members of Qantas here signing an agreement. However, because of Isi's pushiness, trying to use other carriers, which were cheaper than Qantas for his group travel, they decided to destroy him. As I ploughed through my way of the 3 volumes dealing with the Qantas battle, which went to IATA, the very large international travel organization, I was on knife edge, not knowing how it would all end, even though logically I knew that Isi had to win that battle because he went on to build what became known as Jet Set in the 1970s into one of the largest travel companies in the world. This is all dealt with in the book. Isi thought, however, that his business endeavors were not important, and he really didn't want me to include much about them, but I insisted. His battle with Qantas represented his personality, and it also provided him with the financial wherewithal to achieve his goals. It may not have been an end in itself for Isi, but it certainly provided him with the means to achieve those ends he aspired to. One of the fascinating aspects of Isi's life is the way he could build close friendships with key figures, and that particularly applied to Bob Hawke of the Labour Party and Malcolm Fraser of the Liberal Party. Isi ensured that all his activities were completely bipartisan. When a journalist of the Australian Jewish News wrote that he was a supporter of a particular Australian political party in the 1980s, Isi demanded a retraction, insisting that he never aligned himself with one Australian political party. This was important with all his political activities. The Asia Pacific was another key arena for Isi, in his efforts to promote his Jewish agenda, both in support of Judaism in the region and of Israel. Following his election as president of the Executive Council in 1978, he fostered a growing awareness of the importance of the region. He helped form the Australia Pacific Jewish Association, serviced by Kurt Ratner until 1983, by Michael Cohen until 1991, and finally by Eileen Franklin in 1993. As well, he again used an intellectual approach to create a dialogue between Asian Jews and Israelis, sponsoring 3 major Asian Jewish colloquia following a successful conference held at the APJA in May 1980 in Hong Kong. These 3 colloquia were held first in Singapore in 1984, then in Hong Kong in 1987, and finally Beijing in 1992. An example of the way Isi worked to build ties in Asia, and I can't deal with all the Asian countries tonight, was that of China. His first visit to China took place in 1981, shortly after Deng decided to try and open up China a little bit more to world trade and above all tourism from Isi's perspective. Then in 1985, Israeli diplomat Reuven Merhab was posted to Hong Kong as Consul General, and Merhab reached out to Isi. In 1985, as we can see on the screen, Isi undertook his second visit to China. Sorry, I just need a bit of water. Representing the World Jewish Congress, the ECAJ, and the APJE, seeking support to hold a colloquium in Beijing. In 1987, a key event took place with the visit of Dr. Li Shenzi to Melbourne. At his invitation, he was a key figure in the Chinese Communist Party, and Isi invited Reuven Merhab for a dinner, and the two of them met at his place in Melbourne. This was important because at the Hong Kong symposium, the Chinese-led Professor Sidney Shapira, a Jewish American who had become part of the Chinese communist establishment in China, she's known as Xiaobo Li, to attend the symposium. The pendulum was swinging towards Israel and the holding of the Beijing colloquium. While Isi was not the only player in this story, he contributed to this significant sea change for Israel. And as we can see here, is he meeting the Chinese Minister for Foreign Affairs, he with Madame Liu, very important person in the Chinese travel industry. And finally, in 1992, with China's recognition of Israel and the holding of the symposium. Central to Isi's success was the support he gained from the Australian Foreign Minister Gareth Evans, who instructed the Australian ambassador to provide Isi access to every Asian country he was trying to influence, both in terms of the rescission of the United Nations General Assembly 3379 resolution, Zionism is racism, and also either in recognizing Israel, as with China and India, or strengthening ties with Israel, as with Japan and Korea. Another key element in Isi's life from the 1960s onwards was the World Jewish Congress, of which he eventually became senior vice president. This is a topic of a lecture in and of itself. And indeed, from Dr. Nachum Goldman to Philip Klutznick to Edgar Bronfman, there is so much to say. In the book, I devoted 2 chapters to the incredible story of Isi's uncovering of financial irregularities and corruptions, which led to Bronfman and Singer levelling a libel suit against him, and much angst for Isi. It was so important for him to clear his good name. The suit was finally dropped, and before he passed away, Bronfen had lunch with Isi in Jerusalem and told him, "You were right, Singer was stealing from me." But Bronfen did not want to take court action against Singer, and so it never became fully proved, but Singer, it's suspected, misappropriated millions. This is the first time this story has been told in full in the book, and it was very rewarding to have had positive feedback about the accuracy of my account from some of the key players in this story. Getting it right is always a concern for a historian, especially for such a complex and fairly contemporary saga. Finally, in a letter to Isi, upon reading the book, Rabbi Richard Hirsch, Honorary Life President of the World Union for Progressive Judaism, wrote that one thing that made Isi unique among lay leaders was that, and I quote generally, most lay leadership is a consequence of their philanthropic contributions. Your leadership, Isi, is also philanthropic, but primarily intellectual. More than anyone else in your generation, you have used your pen and your voice to advocate for institutional integrity. I believe this really sums up Isi's manifold contributions, which were not only based on his political activism, but also in his ability to put pen to paper and powerfully present his point of view, whether it was for Soviet Jewry in the 1960s, for Israel in the 1970s, against Jewish religious extremism in the 1980s, and then in his retirement, his many columns published in the Jerusalem Post and Israel Hayom, or his fight against corruption in the World Jewish Congress. In all of these things, Isi's power, and we heard from Bill, a power both with spoken, but I think also with the written word. And his intellectual strength had firm foundations in his love of books. This was a love which, from his time in Jerusalem in 1957, as he described in a letter home, he would begin salivating from excitement whenever he passed a bookshop, but he had to check with his parents how much he could spend to when he could buy whatever he wanted. Isi was a bibliophile, but he was also a true Renaissance man with a love of art, music, and all fine things. And he was an absolute perfectionist in everything he did. At the same time, Isi was a family man. One of the challenging issues I faced was in writing the book was whether I should devote a separate chapter just, thematically dealing with the family at the end of the book, or should I integrate this story throughout? I decided this was something that needed to be integrated, sometimes towards the end of a chapter, because Naomi was such a partner and a support for all of his activities. And I wanted to ensure that her role was acknowledged as the chronicle evolved. As we see at the end of the book, with Isi surrounded by, he's got 4 children, 17 grandchildren, an ever-increasing number of great-grandchildren, both mainly in Israel, but also here in Australia, in living in his beloved Eretz Israel, Isi can feel a great, deep sense of achievement. I've been asked about the title of the book, Lone Voice, The Wars of Isi Leibler. Really the suggestion of my editor, Elliot Yeager, who contributed so much to ensure the book was very readable. However, I knew that the title had to have the concept of Isi the fighter in it, because Isi was a fighter all his life, from responding to anti-Semitism in his government high school, through to his battles with Qantas, what might be called one of the great battles of his life with the World Jewish Congress. Isi was never afraid to stand up for what he believed in. I have mentioned how he stood up to Dr. Nachum Goldman, as Isi described him, the king of the Jews, in Strasbourg in 1966, accusing Goldman of Stadlanus because he was advocating secret diplomacy rather than public demonstrations. He was this young 32-year-old upstart from down under, what I call edge of the diaspora, standing up and attacking the most senior leader of the Jewish diaspora. What chutzpah. It was Isi's determination to stand up for what he believed in, whether people agreed with him or not, that made him stand out as a leader, maybe Bill's charisma. As he commented during a video interview with Ehud Ya'ari, was played at the Bar-Ilan book launch held just this last Tuesday evening, he believes a leader should not try to win a popularity contest, but to lead, whether the idea was popular or not. I think Bill believed that people would follow his leadership because of his charisma. But whatever happens, it was his ability and his commitment to his ideals and beliefs that made him such a fascinating character to study and write about. Thank you for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to share what has been a labor of love for me over the last 2 decades and more, having been given this key to the marvelous treasure trove. I hope that this very brief glimpse into the various themes of the book will give you a taste, and that you will read further once the book is available. I can't say here in Australia yet, but hopefully I'm due back in April to participate in person in Australian launches of the book. And thank you again for inviting and listening to me. Toda rabba. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rutland. My running sheet says questions and answers. Are you prepared to take any questions if someone has any questions?
I'd be delighted.
Been frozen.
Have I been frozen?
I can see both of you.
No, you haven't. I'm wondering if anyone's notified David of any questions they want to ask, or if anyone wants to put their hand up and ask a question at this point.
When is it available in Australia? Alex Katz has asked.
I'll stop screen. Shall I stop? I'll stop the screen share. Might be better. That's a question because there's been a bit of hold up of the delivery. Book is actually being printed in China, and it's being published by Hybrid. Louis de Vries hopes it be available early April, mid-April. I'm back in Australia on the 7th of April if my flights don't keep getting changed, and then I have 2 weeks quarantine. So hopefully very shortly. It can be pre-ordered through Hybrid, and all books will be delivered free. There's no delivery charge. So if you want to get in early, you can already pre-order a book. Obviously.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions?
You may need to unmute yourself if you're trying to speak.
No.
Judith has said the book is available in Australia on Kindle.
Yes, it would be, definitely.
Can I have a question, Suzanne? It's Frances here. Is that all right, Gary?
Yeah.
Yes, go for it, please.
I guess what I want to ask is about the process of writing and Isi's input. Like, as you write, what is his involvement in your writing? Was he micromanaging you? Was he did he have carte blanche? Something in between?
It's a great question, Frances. When I got the key, so to speak, and I actually had no idea. I came in 1999, visited my son. Diane Steinman had asked me to write the history of the ECAJ. I've got to finish it now. She'd raised some funds from Isi, and I had a meeting with him. And he said, look, I was coming to Jerusalem for Shabbaton in the middle of the year. He said, you're welcome to work in my archive. I had no idea what was there. And when we talked about it, he said, I have one criteria of your using my archive, that I read everything before it's published. This is well before the biography, well before the biography was even thought of. So I agreed to that, not quite knowing how it would all work. And I even asked Isi, do you want it in writing, this agreement? He said no. So between that and when I actually started, and he started to ask me about writing this biography, I had written and published a number of pieces from the archive, all of which he had read, all of which he might have corrected a typo, made a minimal comment, whatever. There was no micromanagement. Were there any micromanagement, I would not have agreed to write the biography. And I also did it as a labor of love. I didn't want, I mean, for me, if, you know, I said Isi's good name was the most, in terms of the libel suit, wasn't just $6 million, it was his good name. And he went through so much that was the most amazing story of corruption. And you know, people read those chapters. I think I have done my job in terms of a biographer. But for me, I'm a historian. My intellectual integrity is the most important thing. So no, I would not have agreed to do the biography if I thought that Isi was going to micromanage. And don't forget, I'd already written with Sam Lipsky, Let My People Go. So I had already had the experience of producing a major book in which Isi, and I think Sam will totally endorse this, made minimal corrections or involvement. He read every chapter and he would, you know, sort of comment, great chapter with the biography, maybe occasionally correct something, but no micromanagement. I worked out right at the beginning the chapter schedule. I think one comment related to what was initially chapter 16, and Isi suggested us was to do with the Olympic Games story, that I split that into two. I mentioned he was against me writing all about the Qantas battle, but it's 2 chapters in the book, no micromanagement there. It's interesting because he's such a domineering person and I'm a very soft person. So, but you see, Isi is a true intellectual. And when it comes to this, and you know, I'm not sitting in his amazing library because I was worried there'd be too much going on around in what I consider my second home in Jerusalem, because I've spent so many hours researching there. But he values the intellect, and that's what I appreciate. And I said when the book came out, Isi, I really appreciated the fact that you didn't interfere. And he said, thank you for saying that.
Suzanne, if I may just add to that, Isi and I have had a number of fights, particularly about claims conference issues, which we didn't see eye to eye on, but we were always able to put those issues aside. They were issues, they were not a personal thing. So we could quite happily, all 4 of us, Naomi and Isi and Bob and I, go and have dinner, and those issues would not come up and they would not interfere in the friendship. He would never ever hold your views against you if you expressed them strongly enough, I think is the word I'm looking for.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And, you know,
a question purely for curiosity. The extensive notes throughout the book are a wonderful insight in themselves into the treasure trove of the archive, but purely for curiosity, I was amazed at references to letters written by Isi as early as, I recall, 1956. And I wondered why I know that these days one keeps one's own letters on the computer. Prior to that, perhaps one did them on a typewriter with carbon paper, but I wondered what Isi was doing back in the 1950s.
Well, let me tell you, the early stuff went back to his childhood. And I had to struggle through all these letters that he was writing between his parents when they went overseas. And then in 1957, when his father died, he was in Israel. And at some point, his mother, whose handwriting was much more readable, wrote to him and said, Isi, and this was when he was in Belgium after his father died, learning the diamond business, your writing is unreadable. And she said, you better start typing your letters. So yes, I went, look, what can I tell you? There were 80 volumes that I went through, and that's not talking about the 40 volumes I researched for Soviet Jewry. And that was one thing Isi did insist on when the book came, when it came to publication of the book.
So he had made copies of his own letters when writing them, or he got them back from places?
Everything was afterwards. Maybe the very first volume was still the originals, but after that, certainly by 1956, 57, if I head back, I can put my PowerPoint back on for a minute to show you what I'm talking about physically. One sec, let me just share screen again. And let me see if I can, it's just not letting me move. Here we go. This is the archive. Have a look here. These are some of the volumes that I worked through. This is Soviet Jewry. Soviet Jewry was in red. There are 40 volumes of Soviet Jewry. Every single volume is 1,000 pages of documents. It's all chronological, all been photocopied. And I'm holding one of that's the Soviet Jewry volume I'm holding, sorry, go back. It's mind-boggling. It's been donated now to the National Library of Israel. And when the key librarians came to look at the archive, they were bowled over. They said they'd never seen such an organized archive. And I really, as I mentioned before, Hilary was Isi's archivist. She might like to talk a little bit about the process, but it's just, it's staggering. And I haven't finished there. I've still got, once I've finished the ECAJ history, I'm using, that's one of the reasons why I'm here right now in Israel. It's one of the reasons, I mean, I bought my apartment here partly because my son was living here, but I wanted it to be in walking distance of Isi's place because he gave me a treasure trove. And what can I say? I'm just extremely fortunate to have had access for 20 years to what's here. Yeah. It's wonderful that the Historical Society with the National Library of Australia and National Library of Israel has now digitalized all the newspapers. I don't know, hopefully one day they might even digitalize this collection, but it will be a huge job and a huge cost. So I'm not sure how that's going to take place, but at least once I finish using it, it will be available to the general public for research. And yes, that's one thing Isi insisted on was footnotes. I would never write a book without notes. I think to the historical record, a book without notes for the historian later on is extremely frustrating. But he wanted footnotes. As an academic, of course, I couldn't say no because academic publications, of course, are footnotes, not endnotes. Any other questions or comments?
I don't know. Can you hear me?
Who's speaking?
No.
Not sure who's speaking.
Right. Look, it's Jack Leader speaking. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Okay. Look, that was just superb, Suzanne, and I'm really looking forward to reading the book, which we have on order. We've been assured that it would come quite soon.
Yes,
And you know, obviously you are in awe of the man, and hearing Bill Rubenstein's introduction, he is a giant. Yet he was a controversial figure as well, and I've always felt that somehow in Australia he really wasn't recognised, and that something really needs to be done to recognise this giant. Would you respond?
Sorry, recognise the giant.
As a giant in Jewish history, really, and sometimes unfairly criticised in Australia.
There's noise there. Are you talking about Bill or Hillary?
No, about
Bill
him.
Izzy.
No, about Izzy.
To recognise Izzy's contributions?
Yeah.
I don't know. My job's been as a historian. I think
maybe the book will do it.
The book does provide that historical record for the future, because I agree with you. He's the giant of a leader. In terms of other forms of recognition, I mean, it's an AC, I think is the right level for Izzy. He's certainly received plenty of that type of recognition. He's had honorary doctorate from Deakin University, which actually Bill helped to organise when he was at Deakin. So I think he's had I'm not sure what other form of recognition one can have, but I think, I hope, and that's the biography was written, and one of the main criticisms has been by some of the reviewers that it's too detailed. One of the reasons why we made it so detailed is it's a historic record, and there is so much to Izzy's life. I mean, some of the things like Nachum Goldman, I've written a whole chapter in Goldman's biography on that whole issue. You know, other things where I've written whole journal articles on Whitlam, on the Liberal Party in the 60s. Jack, somebody needs to mute themselves. There's a bit of radio on in the background.
Yeah, it's weird because the only ones that are unmuted are you and Gavin and me.
No, there's somebody, yeah, are we? Well, I haven't got anything on in my background.
Someone's turned it off, whatever it was.
Good. So, yeah, I think that my goal with the biography, and look, I put so much time and effort, and it built on everything else that I've done in my research. I mean, I first interviewed Izzy in 1985, 86 when I was doing my doctorate. So it builds. I hope that will be a tribute and a legacy of Isi Leibler. Any other questions or comments before?
Can I just ask whether the book's been reviewed anywhere to this point in time, or is it going to have to await release in Australia for any sort of review?
It has been reviewed overseas, yes. And one of the reviews was published by J-Wire, and I haven't had a chance to look yet. I got an email from Eli Rabinovich that something was in the Maccabean. Jonathan R. Cush, who was president of the British Board of Deputies, and who also works as a journalist, he's written a review which Henry Benjamin kindly published just before the talk today on J-Wire, so you can find that. Colin Schindler wrote a more perhaps academic review for the Jerusalem Post, which, so if anyone wants reviews, I can certainly provide them and maybe send them if to our Sydney branch to put up on the website. But Greer Fay Cashman, who of course is a Melbourne Jew, has done a review for the Jerusalem Report. So, and then there've been a lot of personal pieces. The Jerusalem Post did a whole spread on Isi Leibler in their magazine with front page cover, and coming up, the Jerusalem Report is going to do a few also with the front cover of the Jerusalem Report will be of Isi. So it's getting a lot of coverage in the Jewish world. The Ruthie Bloom, who's a very well-known journalist, wrote a personal piece in the JNS, the Jewish News Syndicate, sorry, and that was published even in American newspapers, that same piece, etc. So it's had a lot of media coverage overseas. We're waiting with the Australian coverage till the book's actually available, and it's a shame it's taken so long.
Yes, thank you. David, I assume that the sound has been going in and out a little. It's probably time to thank Professor Rutland for a very stimulating address, which has whetted, I think, everyone's appetite, and I think you can probably look forward to record sales once it finally hits the market in Australia. Well, let's hope so. And can I thank you on behalf of the Australian Jewish Historical Society, the Victorian branch, but I think we have a few in from New South Wales tuned in, for a terrific address this evening, and we all look forward to reading the book. David, I don't think there's anything else, if you're still with us, that needs to be done. I don't know. Are we in a position to? That's it. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for attendance. There were close to 45 or 50 people, so we've done very well with our Zoom meetings over the last 12 months, and hopefully we'll be back to in person fairly soon. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Suzanne. Greatly appreciated.
There was one other question on the chat.
Yes.
Someone was asking whether there was much in the book about Isi's brother Mark, and whether or not you had any conversations with Michael Gwenda, who recently published an unauthorized biography of Mark.
Right. Actually, I did interview Mark, of course. But in terms of Michael, this book took a long time writing. I think certainly went over a period of, it's a long book, much longer than Mark's biography. I think I worked on it for at least 3 years writing. So I only learned about Michael working on Mark's biography much later. So I didn't consult with Michael directly at all, and neither of us communicated actually before our books appeared, but I certainly did interview Mark, as I did with, other key players. My book is much more archival based, and Michael's book is much more oral history. And I think that the differences of the books very much reflect our different professions, if I can put it that way. I mean, I'm a historian and he's a journalist. So we, my approach is historical with footnotes, with, as you heard, every letter, every person, everything is quoted, exactly where it comes from. Michael is a journalist. He's produced a great book, highly readable, but it's written as a professional journalist, not as a professional historian. Very, two great books for different approaches.
Thank you, David. You might want to, yes, sorry.
I want to say we did have a symposium, Michael and myself, through the Australian Association for Jewish Studies, and we're hoping to find a way, that's been recorded and edited, and we're hoping to find a way of getting that for anyone who is a member of the association to listen to. So you can join the association. We have a variety of people are pensioners or students. Afterwards, if you want to listen to that. And it was a very interesting symposium. Michael, myself, and Gary Sturgis as the chair.
Thanks very much, Suzanne. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, everybody.